Wearing nostalgia goggles can make criticism difficult. There are, of course, entire YouTube channels dedicated to this premise and trying to give things a more fair or critical review while removing that aspect. I, however, don't know if I could do that with some of the shows that really cemented my love of anime, such as Digimon, Sailor Moon, and Tokyo Mew Mew. If I were to review any of those shows, there would be an unfairness that I think would be difficult to work through, a bias, if you will. However, I have not consumed everything from the 90s and early 2000s, and so I had the enjoyment of being able to look at something with fresh, unnostalgic goggle eyes this past weekend. I asked my boyfriend to pick any anime for us to watch, and he picked YuYuHakusho. I knew this show, of course, was a classic 90s show. I'd seen plenty of ads for it, plenty of stuff at conventions, but I never really experienced it myself simply because it just wasn't a show I considered watching. When I first got into anime, I really focused on shoujo shows and things that I knew would appeal to me more easily, and I unfairly sort of wrote off a lot of shonen shows because I was just sure, I wouldn't be interested in that. So this was a new experience for me, and I'm happy to say that without any sort of bias, Yu Yu Hakusho holds up to the standards of a good anime for today. There is a strong 90s feeling that I do admit twinges at me a little bit. You've got the aesthetics with the bright colors and the way that characters sort of stand out from the background, the way that cities are portrayed, and also the kind of fun background music along with sound effects that you get in the 90s anime that can be a little goofy at times, but also helps just really set the tone and is sort of just very memorable from the era. So I don't see why that makes it better or worse, honestly. But it's more than that. For one thing, the dub isn't awful, which means a lot coming from me. I'm not a huge fan of most dubs, and older dubs tend to be even more cringy, just because I think they were figuring some things out, and, I just tend to stay away from them, but we decided to do the dub for this, since it was more nostalgic for who I was watching with, and, it's pretty good. You've got Justin Cook, Laura Bailey, people who are classics in the industry and are very talented, and, no one annoyed me too much. So that's always saying something. Let's get into the story itself, though. What I really like is right off the bat, you've got stakes that both make sense and feel meaningful. Anime is, of course, known for sort of goofy, wild premises that can sound really strange on paper, sometimes even incorporating them into the name to make one of those really long names, like, is it okay to pick up girls in a dungeon? Stuff like that. The premise of this show is our main character, Yusuke, gets hit by a car and turns into a ghost. Right there, you've got a little bit of wildness with supernatural elements being introduced, a very anime sort of thing. However, the show is very grounded in the connections that the main character has with his friends and his family. His mom's a single mom who he has a strange relationship with. He's got this girl at school that's very much probably into him. And, those all feel like real relationships that make sense to us. So even when we're introduced to this whole premise of him being a ghost, it doesn't feel like, I can't relate to this at all. Because you can understand why he wants to get back. It sort of plays on the a la A Wonderful Life sort of feeling that he didn't really know how much the people around him cared about him. He was a delinquent, had problems at school, fought with his mom at times, and didn't also always necessarily feel like he was valued in his place in society. And so he sees how much people do care about him, including some people at school, including his rival, including even some of the teachers, even though some of the teachers are also jerks. But it did seem like maybe some of them actually cared, that one who yelled at the others at the funeral. And this gives him real stakes. He needs to get back. Of course, this is just the first arc. Eventually he does return to his body, but then by this point we've built this world, both of the grounded world with his family and his friends, and the supernatural world with these interesting characters that we keep being introduced to, like Botan and company. And, so even once we've taken away sort of that initial premise that's hooked you, because he is returned in his body, we've still got a lot of places to go, because he's got to balance his relationship between these two different worlds, his Earth world and his supernatural world. So as I get into these later arcs, I'm excited to see what happens with that. I don't know how the quality is throughout the entire show, the movies. I don't know if it stays the top-notch quality that I've seen in this first arc. Shonen shows can have a lot of filler, especially when they go on a long time. And I'm happy to make an update video later if my opinions have changed on the overall show. But my opinions on the opening are strong. It holds up. It's still a classic today, and you should definitely watch it if you haven't watched it. I think some people can be turned off of older art if you've never experienced it before, but I think YuYuHakusho is an example of really some good 90s art that's still really easy to look at, and you can identify all the characters. I always mention this when I'm reviewing a show because there's so much modern anime where you look at the characters and their faces look basically the same and it's just their hair is a different color. No, these characters are all identifiable. They have very strong haircuts and face shapes even vary. Not to mention they actually look like middle schoolers who are in middle school, which is huge props. More power to ya. You don't see that a lot. There are so many shows that I look back on and I'm like, oh, they were supposed to be in middle school. Ultramaniac comes to mind. Love that show, by the way. So not dissing that show in any way, but yeah, they don't really look like they're in middle school. You could maybe pull off high school, but that's part of the clamp, tall people drawing style that they seem to be emulating. Not what we're going into here. So I'm excited to keep going. Really, the only thing I didn't enjoy about the show was some of the fan service because of the characters being in middle school. It felt a little uncomfortable to me, but that's very typical of the anime of the time and of now, so I'm not going to pretend to complain about that. Other than that, everything's moving along at a pretty decent pace. I'm excited to see what new arcs and new characters are introduced because I'm aware I haven't even been introduced to a lot of the main cast yet. And like I said, if there's any character, any arc, specific season or movie you would like me to talk about, leave a comment down below, ask your question. I'd be happy to address it in a follow-up video. Until then, thanks for watching, and peace out.